Thursday, March 11th, 2004. Madrid. It's 7:30 in the morning. The city is waking up to its daily routine. Blue-collar workers, students, immigrants, and office clerks packed the commuter trains connecting the southern and eastern working-class neighborhoods to the bustling heart of the capital. Spain is exactly 3 days away from a general election. The political climate is tense, polarized, but absolutely no one in the entire country expects what is about to happen. At 7:37 a.m., that sense of normalcy is shattered by a brutal, irreversible blow. 3 backpacks loaded with roughly 10 kilos of explosives and shrapnel detonate inside a train that has just pulled into track 2 at Atacha station. There is no warning, no time to react, no time to run, no time to even process what is happening. The sheer force of the blast wave tears the railcars apart from the inside, turning parts of the structure into fatal, high-velocity projectiles. The platform, which seconds earlier was just a sleepy murmur of people reading the paper or listening to music, is engulfed in thick dust, suffocating smoke, and an eerie, surreal silence that precedes absolute panic. Just 1 minute later, at 7:38, the horror strikes again, compounding the tragedy. 2 more detonations split a double-decker train right down the middle as it makes its stop at El Pozo del Tío Raimundo, a deeply working-class neighborhood. Entire rail cars are completely obliterated. Chaos reigns across the tracks and platforms amid twisted metal and the victims who, mere moments before, were simply looking out the window on their way to work. Almost simultaneously, miles away, another blast derails a 3rd train at Santa Eugenia station, causing the railcar structure to collapse entirely and trapping dozens of passengers in a mangled wreck of steel. And at 7:39, the final blow lands. A chain of 4 explosions rips through a 4th train idling on Tella Street, waiting for the green light to enter Atacha, barely 500 meters from the main station. The detonation completely destabilizes the train's framework, throwing victims onto the tracks in the midst of an incomprehensible scene. That makes 10 successive explosions in a span of just 4 minutes, an attack calculated down to the millimeter to inflict maximum damage during rush hour. 3 additional devices failed to trigger. Had they detonated, the catastrophe would have reached even more unimaginable proportions. As the dust slightly settles, the first line of rescue isn't the emergency services. It's the survivors themselves. Dazed people covered in soot, suffering from severe acoustic trauma due to the brutal pressure drop, walk through jagged debris to try and help those buried under the rubble. The first police officers, firefighters, and paramedics to arrive are met with a devastating, warlike scene right in the heart of Europe. There's one haunting detail that the rescue teams will never forget. Through the silence and the moans, an incessant chorus of dozens of cell phones begins to ring. They were ringing from beneath the tangled iron, inside abandoned bags, next to the fatally wounded. They were the calls of desperate family members who, after seeing the news, were trying to reach their loved ones, calls that would never be answered. The city goes into gridlock. Madrid's hospitals activate maximum emergency protocols. Given the sheer scale of the event, medical facilities are overwhelmed, and the IFEMA Convention Center has to be hastily repurposed into a massive makeshift facility to hold the victims and allow families to identify their loved ones. The human toll of those 4 minutes makes your blood run cold. 192 people lost their lives. 192 life stories cut short in an instant. There were citizens from 17 different countries. Nearly 2,000 people were injured, many severely, bearing lifelong physical and psychological scars. In less time than a routine morning commute, Spain had just suffered the worst attack in its modern history. To understand how things reached this point, and what unfolded over the next 72 hours, we have to look at the political chessboard. Spain was governed by the Conservative Popular Party, led by Prime Minister José María Aznar. His government enjoyed an absolute majority, and a year prior, he had made a drastic decision that deeply fractured the country, unconditionally backing the United States and George W. Bush in the invasion of Iraq. He did so against the overwhelming opinion of the Spanish public, who had staged historic protests chanting, "No to war." On the other hand, Spain had spent decades being severely battered by the domestic terrorism of ETA, the Basque separatist group that had claimed the lives of over 850 people since the late 1950s. Polls showed Aznar's candidate, Mariano Rajoy, as the clear frontrunner for the upcoming election on Sunday, March 14th. Faced with the chaos of that March 11th morning, the state machinery reacts, but it does so with a very particular political tunnel vision. The government immediately, and without hesitation, points to a single culprit. It was ETA. The Minister of the Interior, Ángel Acebes, steps up to the press podium and categorically claims the Basque group is behind the events. Every political leader, the media, and the public accept this version in the early hours. But inside police precincts, the details don't add up at all. This was a simultaneous, massive strike, with no prior warning to evacuate and no immediate claim of responsibility. ETA always gave warnings. ETA didn't carry out indiscriminate acts of this magnitude on working-class commuter trains. It wasn't their MO. Nevertheless, mere hours after the event, Prime Minister Aznar personally begins calling the editors-in-chief of the country's major newspapers, like El País and El Mundo, assuring them there's no doubt the Basque group is the author. The government even pushes the United Nations to pass a resolution explicitly condemning ETA by name. While the government insists on its political narrative, forensics and field investigators start uncovering the pieces of the material truth, clues that point in a radically different direction. The first massive crack in the story appears in Alcalá de Henares, the starting point for the targeted trains. A local custodian reports a white Renault Kangoo van parked near the station, with individuals acting suspiciously early that morning. When police inspect it, they find copper detonators inside, along with a cassette tape. It wasn't material related to the Basque environment. They were Quranic verses recited in Arabic. But the definitive piece of evidence, the perpetrator's fatal mistake that changes Spanish history, arrives in the early hours of March 12th. Among the tons of recovered items from the stations, gathered at a precinct in Vallecas, a phone rings from inside a sports duffel bag. It's the famous Vallecas backpack, a device that failed to detonate. Bomb squad experts managed to defuse it with pinpoint precision. Inside, they find goma tuicio explosives, shrapnel to amplify the damage, and a Mitsubishi Triumph cell phone modified with wires to act as a timer. That phone contained a SIM card. Within hours, the digital footprint of that tiny piece of plastic leads the police straight to a calling center in the Madrid neighborhood of Lavapiés. The shop was run by Jamal Zugum, a Moroccan national. Zugum was no stranger to authorities. His name had already appeared in previous intelligence reports linked to international extremist networks. The police evidence becomes overwhelming. There's no trace of ETA. This is a jihadist cell. And here, reality forces us back down to earth, because this tragedy wasn't masterminded from some remote cave. It was born from a lethal alliance between fanaticism and petty, common street crime. The perpetrators needed explosives. How did they get them? Through José Emilio Suárez Trashoras, an ex-miner from Asturias, a police informant diagnosed with schizophrenia, who dealt narcotics on a small scale. Trashoras had access to stolen material from the Conchita mine. One of the terror cell's leaders, Jamal Ahmadin, alias El Chino, traveled to Asturias and bought dozens of kilos of explosives from him. The price? Hard cash and narcotics. That was the dirty, mundane business transaction that armed the devices on those trains. We reach Friday the 12th and Saturday the 13th of March. The government now has solid police evidence on its desk pointing to an international plot, a brutal and direct reprisal for Spain's involvement in the Iraq War. Admitting this barely 48 hours before the polls opened meant admitting that the government's foreign policy had brought dire consequences to domestic soil. The political cost was incalculable. Aznar's administration decides to double down. They publicly stick to their initial theory. Minister Acebes continues to sow doubt, claiming their primary line of investigation remains the Basque group. They try to silence or downplay the discovery of the van and the Quranic tape, explicitly denying to the international media the involvement of other groups. But the official story cannot hold up. International press, like the London-based Arabic newspaper Al-Quds Al-Arabi, received statements claiming responsibility for the acts. In Spain, the real information starts to leak. Citizens realize the government is hiding vital facts from them out of pure electoral calculation. In an era long before WhatsApp or social media, popular outrage finds its own channel, SMS text messages. On Saturday, March 13th, the official day of electoral reflection, where campaigning is legally forbidden, a text message starts bouncing from phone to phone across Spain. Is Aznar going to get away with this? They call it a day of reflection while Adasi, the state TV news anchor, is still working. Today, March 13th, at 6 p.m. PP headquarters. Pass it on. Within hours, tens of thousands of citizens surround Genoa Street, the ruling party's headquarters in Madrid, and its regional offices nationwide. Banging pots and pans in the rain, they shout slogans like, "We want the truth before we vote," and "Our dead are not your votes." It's a grassroots uprising, a social turning point fueled by grief and a deep sense of betrayal. The next day, Sunday, March 14th, Spain votes. Turnout is massive. Defying every poll taken before that Thursday, the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party, PSOE, led by José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero, sweeps the ballots and wins the election. 72 hours after the blasts, the events hadn't just destroyed 4 trains and claimed 192 lives. They had completely overturned a government. One of the new prime minister's very first actions would be to withdraw Spanish troops from Iraq. But the political shift doesn't halt the judicial and police machinery. If anything, the manhunt accelerates. On April 3rd, 3 weeks after March 11th, investigators managed to corner the direct culprits. 7 core members of the cell are barricaded in an apartment on Carmen Martín Gate Street in Leganés, a town south of Madrid. The National Police's Special Operations Group, GEO, surrounds the building. They urgently evacuate all neighbors from the block and adjacent buildings. They attempt to open negotiations, but the response is gunfire from inside and religious chants echoing down into the street. At 9 p.m., finding themselves completely cornered with no way out, the individuals make their final decision. They coordinate the detonation of roughly 20 kilos of explosives they still had stockpiled in the apartment. The blast is massive. The 7 perpetrators lose their lives instantly, blowing out a huge section of the building's facade, which rains down onto the street below. The shock wave hits the police perimeter and instantly takes the life of GEO Sub-Inspector Francisco Javier Torrentras. He would become the 193rd victim of this tragedy. The subsequent events would add another layer of fanaticism, when weeks later, radical individuals raided the cemetery to severely desecrate Torrentras' remains. 3 years later, in 2007, after a painstaking investigation, the macro trial takes place at the National Court, presided over by Judge Javier Gómez Bermúdez. During those 3 years, certain media outlets fueled what became known as the conspiracy theory. They insisted, twisting facts and fabricating doubts, that ETA and international groups had collaborated, or that dark factions within the state had allowed the act to happen to shift the country's political course. The trial, monumental in its scale and public attention, dismantled all those theories with hard forensic evidence. The final ruling established the irrefutable legal truth. The authorship belonged exclusively to extremist cells acting in response to Spain's involvement in Iraq. There was no involvement from ETA, nor were there any internal state conspiracies. Jamal Zugum and Othman El-Nawi were convicted as material authors and sentenced to over 42,000 years in prison each. The ex-miner José Emilio Suárez Trachoras was sentenced to 34,000 years for supplying the materials. Although the numbers seem astronomical, Spanish law caps the maximum effective prison time, served at 40 years. March 11th was not the result of a shadowy conspiracy. There were no complex secret pacts. It was the result of a chain of extreme, fanatic decisions facilitated by common criminals who traded dangerous materials for drug money, followed by a government's clumsy attempt to manipulate reality to save an election. Today, at Atocha station, the trains still pull in and out, and people still wake up early to commute. But a monument stands there, forcing us to never forget those 192 people who, on a Thursday morning 2 decades ago, boarded a train for work or school, and ended up becoming the innocent faces of an event that forever changed the recent history of Spain.